of the morning. And we did have at least one interested in public comment. If you are interested in commenting publicly on workforce development, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay, well, we have now two. Come on, so we'll start with you, sir, and then we'll move over to you.
Hello.
Got it.
Thanks for having me. My name is John Stokes, founder of Space Dow LLC. You can go to spaceranch.org/legal to see our on-chain governance, Mr. Sith. We are a pilot project for the Dow LLC business designation, and our mission is to bring the space industry to Wyoming, space launch to Wyoming, and define the space tech fintech corridor along I-25. So I'd like to discuss the future of work and retention of talent within the state and within the Web3 and space industry. Let me start off with a mathematical theorem, the Pareto's principle, 80-20 rule. The derivative of that suggests that the square root of the workforce is what is responsible for 50% of the work. So if you have a workforce of 16, the square root of that is 4. 4 of those individuals are going to be responsible for 50% of the work. So our goal is to make that not matter. And the way the future of work is going to progress, we're going to see more of the management of the tasks instead of management of the individual. And we're seeing this progress with the concept of bounties, and those are essentially tasks that as they're completed, they get rewarded with cryptocurrency. So with our business designation as the Dow LLC, we're able to take protocol funding grants to our Dow Treasury, delegate those funding through proposals through an exchange such as Kraken, deposit to our bank account, and pay out to payroll. I think that's the first of its kind liquidity rail between protocol funding and real world infrastructure. So as we design these concepts for the future of work and for decentralized autonomous organizations and the workforces that are needed to make that work, some of the concepts we're designing, we've named the formicary, which is a term for an anthill ant colony. And we're essentially mapping out ways to have a web of trust that can validate these participant skill sets and essentially be able to fill last minute jobs. So we're looking at like the event industry or like emergency response, and eventually leading up to being able to do rocket launches at the decentralized spaceport we're building. So I have 2 proposals that I would like to bring to the state, and the first is a public works DAO, which could be developed in parallel with these concepts with the formicary. And the way that could work is like, say there's a bounty to fix a pothole, and then we, match that with an individual that's capable of doing that and through the decentralized workflow. And then the second proposal is intern grants for Dow LLCs, and it'd be structured a way where the cash is up front and done in a meritocratic base, so that we have, start out with like a $5,000 chance, $10,000 chance, etc. And give you an immediate real world example. After lunch break, I was able to speak with one of the students that was on the panel earlier, and he expressed interest working with our organization. And so we need the funding to be able to hire him. And if capital is going to be allocated to educational experiences, and I think that is one great use of capital. So, any questions?
Committee. That sounds very, very helpful. Thank you for sharing that with us. All right.
So, is a public works Dow like something that we could open a dialogue on as like a real world proof of concept of future of work and decentralized autonomous organizations coinciding with public works, public interests, public goods.
That's your co-chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So that's the first I heard of that specific concept. I think it's an interesting idea and something that could allow us to match resources with need, as well as prioritizing. I think it's worth exploring. Have you contemplated or put together the architecture side of it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, right now we're just working with platforms that already are mapping out how to work with platforms that exist, such as DWork, and that's a bounty management platform. And then we're also using the Dow tooling from Astro Dow to kind of manage the functions for voting and proposals. So, as far as like being able to use available tools and make it work, that's something that's doable now. And then, abstracting it into a different type of modality and dashboard that uses different smart contracts and is chain agnostic in the future is totally doable. So,
have you thought about what a workable pilot for it might be? And I was thinking, university scale, city scale, county, something along those lines might be a good way to approach it. Establish the architecture, put together a DAO, and then see if you can get some matching funding and a process for prioritization. Honestly, local might be an easier approach to get it started and see how it works. It's a thought. I don't know what other models might lend themselves to it, but local government or something like the university or one of the colleges would be other avenues where they have obviously significant budgets for maintenance and repair that could then be brought to bear based on the algorithms that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of doing it really, because all the pieces of puzzle are there. It's just a matter of having the job providers met with the people that can do the work, and then just having the onboarding process. And I guess these are kind of incorporating problems that need to be solved with both digital identity and organizational management. So I guess the way I would see it work is just kind of initiating participants into it, and then having like a membership identity mechanism, and then start associating like soul-bound NFTs that match, skills as those skills are verified and vetted, and then that kind of be the initial proof of concept, and then iterate from there.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Sid.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I see that Space Ranch Dow tomorrow at midnight will be offering NFT memberships. So congratulations on that. That sounds exciting.
Thanks. That launch date was tentative. I think we're gonna push that back because we want to do some more development milestones. So add some more features to it to make it functional. But we have our live demo on the near testnet at spacedow.xyz. You could see the scroll down, there's a video that shows the transaction life cycle of purchasing the membership, which generates a add member proposal to our DAO dashboard. And then we'd like to make that process a little bit more less edgy, more refined before we make it public or do it to the public launch. But
All right. Thank you again for your testimony. We appreciate it.
thanks.
Next up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Colin Crossman. I live in Cheyenne. I own a business in Gillette. The business is Distributed Hash. We are a small hosted mining facility, and the reason I'm speaking now instead of tomorrow is because of the points that were brought up by Crypto Knights and also Representative Yin. One of the issues in being a host is billing, and as Representative Yin mentioned, or the question he asked, I believe, was you're not billing by kilowatt hour. Correct. That would be illegal. However, being able to bill by the kilowatt hour would actually align the incentives of the host and the customer. And there's good reasons why you can't resell power, but in the niche context of a data center, I believe it can be carved out such that it would not violate any sort of public mores or anything to be able to bill inside of a data center for kilowatt hour usage. Specifically, if that power is being bought from a regulated utility, tax paid, and is not leaving the site. So I believe I had sent an email to both of you, Mr. Chairs, as well as copying Representative Yin with a proposed piece of legislation that I had drafted and was looking to mention.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic that isn't one that we've addressed before, and I appreciate you bringing it to us. We've talked a lot about large scale purchase of power, but it's actually the opposite side of the spectrum here, which is the internal purchase of power, so to speak, as a subcontract. And once again, it's going to violate our regulated utility statutes in a way that would need to be addressed. It does seem very reasonable. And I don't even think this is, well, we'll see. I shouldn't speak for the regulated utilities. But it doesn't seem to conflict with the concerns that I understand that they have, because it's already a sale of power from them that has taken place. So it's an after sale effectively. And in this instance, I think you've already got a sale of power where a sales tax event would take place. So honestly, there might be something along those lines that we can use to delineate it, which is that once sales tax has been paid, you can resell or something along those lines. I don't know. This is something we can explore, though. Hopefully it's not a major tweak to address, but it's obviously very reasonable for you to direct bill for power internally as a subcontract arrangement. And if we're holding that back, then we should find a solution for it. Committee, I see.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So we actually have a carve out for this for electric vehicles specifically, similar to how we have a carve out for public utilities for compressed natural gas sales for compressed natural gas vehicles. So if the application of the statute is particularly niche, I think it is appropriate. I think there are good reasons, as Mr. Crossman said, for having not the ability to just resell power willy-nilly, but for this specific instance where, power is part of the infrastructure where the power differential could be very different between customer to customer, it might make sense to allow for a per kilowatt hour charging basis.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I'll just follow up and say that we'll explore this some more and talk to folks at our Public Service Commission about whether they've had any internal conversations about this and as well as the regulated utility folks. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at some larger utility revision that are very much the other end of the spectrum on the Minerals Committee, but this is on both our topic of discussion conversation here as well as the Minerals Committee. So stick with us and we'll follow up on this. Maybe there's a simple, easy fix like we did for the electric vehicles, which is conceptually similar, where we were running into struggles on the idea that you effectively have a direct resale when you're providing the power to the vehicles, and it's not as a regulated utility at that point. It's sort of after the fact. So we'll stick with us on this and we'll follow up. This is a good one. We appreciate you bringing it to us.
Thank you.
Any public comment online? Any public comment online? Any public comment, further public comment in the room? Yes.
Good afternoon, Chairman and everyone on the committee. My name is Robert Malka. I'm a part of the Bitcoin Today Coalition, which is based in Wyoming. We advocate for Bitcoin to multiple state legislatures and to the federal legislature, to the Congress. And then I'm also part of the curriculum development team for an organization called My First Bitcoin, or Mi Primer Bitcoin, which establishes is educating on Bitcoin in El Salvador, where Bitcoin is legal tender. And we've had a conversation about the possible interest for Wyoming to modify K through 12 graduation requirements, specifically high school requirements, so that knowledge of Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and blockchain is required to graduate at some point. And I wanted to offer my ability to be helpful should the committee and the education committee also be interested in modifying graduation requirements or financial literacy, so that Wyoming can be the most progressive state on blockchain, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrencies in the country, where as of yet, no similar mandate or no similar requirement is established.
Are there states who have adopted this as a standard for graduation?
There is current discussion in the Texas legislature, but there has not been any official requirement passed yet.
Okay, and do you know what that looks like? Is it a standalone standard, or is it, you mentioned financial literacy, is it folded into something broader like that?
It seems to me that the best application for this would probably be to fold it under financial literacy as a requirement. Yes, particularly for Bitcoin.
Committee? All right. Well, thank you for your testimony.
Yes, thank you.
Any additional public comment? All right, we will close public comment and we will move on to our next topic. Right on schedule, open banking. Yeah, we have draft 23 LSO 0159, the fourth version. Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson, the Legislative Service Office, walking through 23 LSO 159, working draft 0.4, open banking. At the last committee meeting, committee did request that a bill draft on open banking be provided, just kind of structured to notify banks or let them know that they can in fact provide for open banking and give them that ability or knowledge that they can do so. What this bill draft does then is provide some definitions on page 2 that defines customer data and express written consent. The main definition, I think the most important one there is up, would be the open banking, and I'm actually noticing a typo we'll have to fix on, that should be paragraph 3, not paragraph 2. But that definition means that open banking means providing access to customer data from the customer's bank to a third-party financial service provider with the express written consent of the customer and through the use of application programming interfaces. The next section provides that a bank may participate in and provide for open banking. Provides on page 3 that a bank participating in and providing for open banking shall comply with all applicable state and federal laws and regulations, including laws and regulations relating to the protection and use of customer data. It provides that prior to releasing that data, they shall obtain the customer's express written consent. Subsection C then provides that the commissioner shall adopt rules and regulating the collection, use, and disclosure of customer data in open banking consistent with all applicable state and federal laws and regulations. Section 2 then provides that the banking commissioner shall adopt all rules necessary to implement this act on or before July 1st, 2024. And section 3 provides that it will be effective July 1st, 2024, except as otherwise provided there, that sections 2 and 3 would be effective immediately. The reasoning for that date was just to give the time, or the Division of Banking time, to promulgate rules necessary. That date, of course, can be set at the committee's discretion. I would note there's a few things this draft doesn't do. It doesn't really provide notice or requirements of the Division of Banking as far as what those regulations might look like in protecting customer data. So that's certainly something for the committee to consider if they want to require more of the division. And I would, one potential amendment for the committee to consider as well, on page 3, line 6, changing the word releasing to providing access to make it more consistent with how it's described in the definition. So instead of prior to releasing any customer data, it could be prior to providing access to any customer data. And with that, I would stand for, well, one other note for the committee to consider or to keep in mind is, as this deals with Title 13, it would, the committee would not be able to sponsor, it would need to go to minerals for sponsorship. And with that, I'd stand for any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sif.
Mr. Hopkinson, thank you for your work on this. The proposed draft bill, because it makes it permissive for a bank to provide the customer's, customer data to a third-party financial service provider with the express written consent of the customer, doesn't change what banks can already do, does it? And is the value added of this bill that it directs the Division of Banking to adopt rules about how that happens, whereas right now we don't have rules, or what's the value added of the bill, I guess?
Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Stith, at the last meeting, one of the I guess comments noted was that this would notify banks that they can do this if they might otherwise not have that explicit kind of guardrails in place for them to do it. They might not be comfortable doing it. So this would give them some idea that that is available to them, I think was one of the values added as part of this.
And I think the second part of your analysis builds off of that comment, which is that because there is rulemaking authority, they theoretically, the banking division could craft rules that would make them more comfortable knowing that they can operate within this sphere and what are the rules without us necessarily legislating it.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, quick comment on that. Yeah, this probably falls into the category which we've had a few times, which is we think it's probably legal, which is never really a great way to operate a bank and probably any other business. So not only that, but the clarity, I think there are some aspects of this that we want to be explicit in. And the one that is here is express written consent to engage. I think it's important that if we're going to see this, that we statutorily have that. And then the rule and regulation process, as we work through that, since this would go into effect July 1st, 2024, one of the advantages of that is that it would give us another opportunity to work on statute where we think, oh, upon learning more, well, this is something we need to tighten down. And I think it's important that we provide that longer runway so we understand what the consumer protections that need to be in place are. And until we go down that path, I don't know that we know what we really should be thoughtful about. So I think those are the key aspects of the answer.
Mr. Hopkinson, your one additional change on page 3, line 6, providing access to, you said, help me understand that a little more. That was just language consistent in Title 13. or in
No, that
practice?
was, sorry, Mr. Chairman,
You're fine.
that was, that language is used earlier, and I'm just skimming through to find where.
Oh,
that
earlier
is.
in the
But
bill.
earlier in the draft, that it has the language providing access to versus releasing. And so it was just to make those two terms consistent
I see.
internally in the bill draft.
Okay, I'm tracking now. All right. Yeah. Committee? Great. Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Mr. Bishop. And Nick.
Good afternoon again. Thank you.
Is it normal for you to sit an entire space away from your attorney?
It's usually safer. No. No, hope you all had a good lunch. Thanks for having us back after this morning.
Yes.
Just
Commissioner.
again, Jeremiah Bishop, I'm the Commissioner for the Division of Banking. There's about 5 different areas I'd like to go over with this bill and kind of our process on that. The initial scope of potential rulemaking, kind of the subsequent scope of potential rulemaking later on after our initial phase, some of the topics of importance in open banking, just making sure we understand what the legislator's intent is with this bill. And then we have, I guess, one comment on the actual language of this draft. Might take a little bit longer than my last one this morning, but I'll get through it as quickly as I can. Obviously, let me know if you have questions. The first one, initial scope of the potential rulemaking. I think this draft bill has 2 areas where it directs us to create rules. One, adopt rules regulating collection, use, and disclosure of customer data in open banking consistent with applicable state and federal law. And then again, it also requires us to adopt rules necessary to implement this act. So one area that I think it provides very direct purview of what rulemaking should be, and that is the notice and consent structure. Obviously the express written consent and the prior notice, I think that's pretty clear. And so I think that's where we would focus our initial rulemaking authority is to what does that mean? We do have similar structures in place with other digital asset custody that kind of has a similar process that we could kind of learn from and use similar language. I think last time we were here, I think we did say that we would probably use some similar language in the rules of what exists. For example, the current one, I think it's a bank shall provide clear written notice for digital asset custody for about 4 different items. So if we were providing clarity on what this written notice is, it would look very similar to those items. Just kind of with this area, obviously we would not want to do anything to make it more difficult for a bank to engage in open banking. And instead, the rules would be to provide for a more kind of direct roadmap for them to follow under this notice and consent structure so they know exactly what should be included in that. The next item discussion is kind of what do we do after that initial rulemaking process. This one, I think it'd be best if we just took our time after the initial one, kind of see what banks adopt it, what issues come up, things like that. The most likely next area would be under customer agreements. Obviously, to engage in open banking would require a separate agreement with a bank. And again, under digital asset rules, we currently have existing kind of structures on that govern customer agreements with digital assets, whether that's return on digital assets, written agreements on proceeds from staking, things like that. So we would probably leverage some of the existing rule language that we already have in place for digital assets and move that over here once we figure out what that needs to look like. It would not be our goal to dictate the actual content of the agreements on open banking, but we would like to set some maybe baseline requirements in areas relevant to the collection, use, and disclosure of that customer data. A third potential or another potential rulemaking area would be that of third-party vendor management. Obviously, there's three parties with this: the customer, the bank, and this third-party entity. And so the bank would have to go through the traditional vendor management of that third party, whether it's due diligence on the financials, their operating structure, cybersecurity, how that all works. Now, we wouldn't do this at first simply because this is something we currently do with existing banks. We examine all financial institutions for the risk management programs and policies around third-party vendor management. And then also right now, a lot of what this would have to do with is what happens at the federal level. Federal agencies are already currently have proposed guidelines on managing third-party relationships. I don't think they've been adopted yet, but they are out there. I think they've received some comments on them. If those become effective, that's the standard that all of our banks would have to abide by. And so we'd probably wait to see what happens with that rather than just do the exact same thing twice. And kind of following that same thought process, just generally on open banking, right now, I do believe the CFPB is currently working on this issue. Now, I understand they've been doing it for a very long time. I think they were directed out of the Dodd-Frank Act. So it's been a long time working on this. They haven't done it yet. However, I think it was in 2020, I think, they did issue some kind of proposed guidelines, and they received, I think, over 100 comments in this area. And so moving forward, regardless what we do with our rules, if the CFPB comes out and makes their rules, most likely those rules would be adopted by federal banking agencies. And so we would then have to go back and amend our rules to make sure that they mirror whatever federal guidelines are in place. So just wanted to point that is coming, but I do understand we have no idea what that timeline might look like at the federal level. The next point is this topics of importance in open banking. So I already talked about setting rules for written notices, possibly customer agreements, and we'd likely have to identify other topics that we should address in our rules. We haven't really reached any conclusions. We've been digging into it to find out what areas we may need to address in rules. Some of these topics include the data scope, account credentials or screen scraping, data retention requirements, data access transparency, revoking consent or authorization, basic data security, and then data accuracy. These are some of the items we'd have to dive into and learn, just research a little bit more to find out what may need to go into rules at some point in time if we need to. So the kind of the fifth item, and this one, I think goes with some of the topics that we just discussed, is our understanding of your all's intent with this bill. Is obviously very important for us to understand what the legislator's intent is for this bill, so that we can they can kind of guide us in the rulemaking process. Like I said, I think this draft bill, I think it's very clear that the intent and general policies have notice and consent framework. So I said that'd probably be our initial rulemaking process. I think that's very clear. That's the intent of this bill. But as it moves forward, we're going to have to very closely follow what the discussion is on the floor and within the committee of what it is that the legislature is trying to get out of this bill to help direct us in the rulemaking process, just because we do have very broad rulemaking authority with this bill as it stands. Those two areas, it's very, very broad. And so we'd like to hone that in a little bit. Obviously, it's to focus on what you all think is important and provide clarity.
So you had a good list a moment ago about some of the key provisions that would have to go into the rulemaking authority.
Mhm.
And some of those would likely be well served to be in the statute as well at some point. So this is something to contemplate, and we've got a bit of time. I don't think we should rush that deadline any faster than it is, because you lay out a thoughtful process on taking a reasonable approach. We have to balance providing flexibility to Wyoming customers so that they can have the things they want, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we have a rigorous consumer protection process built in place that provides full authority and, I guess, dominion, we'll say, over the open banking on behalf of the individuals, so that they can obviously have full information opting in as well as opt out, contemplating things like data portability and security. So when we talk about, the process as well as the intent, I think this is a very good statutory vehicle to begin the process, but I do think that we not only want you to think about what should be in rule, but as the process goes along, what else should be in statute, so that we can provide the appropriate, teeth and rigor to provide the protective framework for our bankee, the citizens of Wyoming that want to engage in open banking.
Great, thank you. Yes, I appreciate those comments. And I think we're on the same page on that. I think this is early in the process and we have a long runway. I do agree with you on that. That will help us kind of figure some of these issues out. So I wanted to wrap up on some final comments on the specific language of the bill. The first one was already addressed by LSO as far as the definition, or that item on page 3. The other item that we wanted to maybe point out is on page 2, lines, I think it's 14 and 15. Or I'm sorry, 15 and 16 on line 2. And this is the definition of open banking means providing access to customer data from the customer's bank to a third party financial service provider. Maybe putting another more language in that would include or a data aggregator, simply because that third party that the bank is partnering with may not always be a financial service provider. A lot of times it'll be a data aggregator that then works with other financial service providers. And I think this language would limit that to only financial service providers. So I guess the recommendation would be on line 16, would start financial service provider or data aggregator with the express written consent.
Would that be, I see your intent, but then it seems like we're overly broadening it, because you want it to be a data aggregator on behalf of other third party financial service providers, which makes sense. So you have in concept the right limitations, but I don't think we would want it just provided to a data aggregator that then can operate outside the bounds of what our intent is here. So I'm curious how we can rein that in a bit while getting across the concept of a need for some intermediary party. Any thoughts on that?
No, I definitely, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do understand the concept on that of what happens if you give it to a data aggregator and then there's no limits on what they do with it. I think that could open up some issues. So yeah, that is a little bit tricky to walk through whether or not that is with the customer agreements thing, or the those third party agreements. Are there limits in that? And that kind of, some of those other items we talked to may be able to address that if we went into it a little bit more specifically. But no, I do agree. I think if we include that language, that's something that we should work out. But I'll turn that to Nick to see if he has any other questions.
Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bishop, you kind of touched on just making sure we're on the same page, intent, those kind of things. As it stands now, what do you guys perceive our intent to be with this bill?
Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Mr.
What
Chairman.
is our intent?
What is your intent? Yes. My understanding just with this draft right now is that it is to provide a kind of notice and consent standards for open banking. That's kind of what this bill does as it stands right now, is requires express written consent to participate in open banking. From my read through of the bill, that's really all I have right now, is to provide kind of protections in that area.
Presenter?
Chairman, follow up. Commissioner Bishop, I mean, I think in the most literal sense, that's absolutely true, but I think, you know, the entire point of this committee is to really come up with economic development as it pertains to this specific topic. And, you know, to a certain extent, I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants here, but I do think certainly with these speedy banks and this new era of banking that we have, what APIs can do for open banking and just the concept of open banking, I think can really accelerate, I think, innovation as it relates to these speedies. So, you know, I can't give you a fine bullet point, presentation of what the intent is, or certainly my intent was when I brought the motion back in June, but I do think that there is a lot of potential here. I'm sure we're going to make some amendments to this along the way. It's passed into law, and we'll probably have to come back next year and the year after that to make amendments. But I think if we can certainly get something on the books, similar to what I think this committee started doing pre the SF 125, the speedy bill, having something on the books to indicate, as Co-Chairman Roth has said, to signal to these speedies, you don't have to just think this is legal. We have things on the books that clearly explicitly permit this. So that was my intent with the motion I brought, and certainly, best I can tell, that's been kind of the collective intent so far. So I just hope we're on the same page on that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those comments. Things like that do help us kind of narrow in on where we should put our focus on. So I think those are the discussions we'll need to pay attention to. Nick, did you have anything specific to the items we talked about before on the data aggregator?
Counselor?
If I could briefly go back to Senator Rothfuss, your question. I think our goal in raising the concept of the data aggregator is merely to point out that the definition of open banking can encompass two models, can encompass a model in which a bank is sharing customer data directly with a third-party financial services provider. It could also encompass a model in which a bank shares data with a data aggregator who then shares it with a third-party financial services provider.
I don't have any more prepared comments, but if there's any other questions.
Committee? Questions for the commissioner?
Great, thank you, and we'll follow this one as it goes through.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We appreciate it, and we appreciate your work into this, even though it is our intent is slightly ambiguous on what we're working towards. So you've done a wonderful job to frame your comments based on what you know. So appreciate that. I don't think my comments about ambiguity of the statute would be admissible.
Probably not.
Okay. I do know Mr. Meyer was going to appear online. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, and thank you for accommodating me through this Zoom today. Scott Meyer on behalf of the Wyoming Bankers Association, representing over 35 Wyoming community banks. When you talk about open banking, you have to first define really what you mean by this term, at least from our standpoint. In the current bill draft, the term open banking means access to customer data from the customer's bank to a third-party financial provider, and we talked a little bit about that with Commissioner, with the express written consent of the customer and through the use of application programming interfaces. And as Commissioner Bishop alluded to, there's a wide array of arrangements, however, that exist for different levels of open banking. At one end, you have those that argue we already have open banking with the ability of a vendor to sign up with an aggregator such as Intuit, Plaid, or LifeLock, and then download banking information and transaction information for bank accounts to their systems. I will tell you that many fintechs, however, don't really like this because they have to pay the aggregator. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the so-called third-party payment providers, or TPPs. And these are the ones that are really causing the most commotion. TPPs can include, payment instrument issue service providers, which verify the coverage of a given payment. An example of these might be the banks and credit card issuers that are obligated to verify whether a given payment amount can be covered by the PSU account through an application programming interface, or API. Another version would be an account information service provider, which includes the collection and storage of information from a customer's different bank accounts in a single place, which allows customers to have a global view of their financial situation and easily analyze their expenses and financial needs. And then we have payment initiation service providers, which allows other providers to facilitate the use of online banking for making payments online. If you look at the EU's PSD2 deal, their language deals with banks adopting and making available a standardized API that anyone who can write code, which is fintechs, crypto companies, hostile nation states, criminal organizations, individual criminals, and so on, could write a program that interfaces with the bank's standardized API and allow data to be pulled down and potentially transactions be initiated. This version completely disintermediates banks from their customers. Any customer could sign up with a latest shiny fintech online banking site and use this site for their online banking instead of the bank site. In this situation, the bank simply holds the money and guarantees it. This approach also carries the most risk to the consumer, as there is no validating that the provider of the latest shiny thing is actually legitimate and takes the appropriate precautions to protect the customer data. And I think that's where the biggest issue comes in. From these two ends of the open banking spectrum, I'm sure there are middle ground options that exist as well. When looking through the bill draft, I offer the following. The current bill draft provides that a banking participating and providing for open banking shall comply with all applicable state and federal laws and regulations, including laws and regulations relating to the protection and use of consumer or customer data. And I think, as Commissioner Bishop says, we're already doing that, so I'm not sure this section is really needed. We do that already. I'm just saying that's already there. Currently, aggregators must comply with the Cfpb participant rules. Our members believe that anyone that would have consumer financial protection or financial data be subject to those same regulations as banks. Individual banks must be able to vet and approve any system, company, etc., before the vendor can even connect and consume the financial data of the bank. And banks need to have some sort of indemnity if a third party is allowed to consume this information and the third party is then breached. I think, as Commissioner Bishop says, the CFPB has been working on this for quite some time. And even as lately as a couple of weeks ago and then last week, the Biden administration keeps coming up with new ideas of how they deal with digital assets and digital currency and digital exchanges. So I think that these things could still change in the future very quickly. I do think that at this point in time that I think the commissioner is correct in that whatever rules they have, it would probably not time effective for them to draft any rules at this point in time, just because I know the CFPB is about to come out with something and they would probably have to amend them anyway. But anyway, Mr. Chairman, those are my comments and my thoughts on this bill, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Stitt.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meyer, do you have a sense for the economics of this? The bill, assume for the moment that the bill were adopted in its current form with this permissive open banking, would state chartered banks in Wyoming use it, or would they just ignore it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stitt, I will tell you that I believe that there will be customers that will want this. And whether the banks are going to be anxious to adopt it, I don't know. I do believe your small community banks in rural parts of Wyoming probably will be a little bit hesitant to do so, just given the amount of cost that's involved in doing some of this. But as time goes by, those costs will bound to go down. I do think that there are banks probably in the larger communities that have customers that really want to get this and can afford to have this set up. And so you would see some use of it.
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I sense some hesitancy and I can certainly understand that. Would it make you feel better? Certainly your members feel a little bit better if we put more explicitly permissive language in this bill? Because again, we envision this more for these kind of speedy type banks, for giving them more flexibility for financial innovation. We also want to make sure we respect some of these traditional FDIC community banks. If they don't want to do it, that's totally fine. And there should be zero pressure from the legislature or otherwise for them to engage in it. They can only do so should they choose to do so. If we more clearly define that in this legislation, would that relieve some of your angst?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, I don't know that it would change anything. I know that the discussion was kind of focuses a little bit on speedy banks, but actually I think this is a banking question in general. The consumer will dictate what they want and how they want it, and businesses, including banks, will have to respond. Either that or to be left behind. So I don't think that permissive stuff necessarily is what's going to hold it up. What the banks are concerned about, and I think also with the CFPB, is just what is going to be out there and how will it be regulated and how will it be protected. Our thought again is, it ought to belong to have the same requirements as BSA and ALM that the banks currently have to do, whether they're speedy or otherwise. And that third party, the aggregator or any third party after that, but still have to do whatever they need to do just to make sure that data is secure. And that's our biggest concern. It's not the being able to provide it necessarily, it's making sure that we have very safe recipients of that data so it's not lost.
Mr. Meyer, to follow up on your point, if you were to distill down the banking concerns to, who is regulating and what will it look like? Do you think in crafting a solution here, it would be better to codify in statute those regulations, or is it better to leave them up to the banking division to craft them? What do you see as the better solution to clarifying what the rules are and who is the regulator?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm fairly good friends with the commissioner, so I don't want to put him into hot water. But honestly, I think that a lot of the rulemaking can be done from the commissioner's level only because, as he testified, and as I believe as well, is that those rules will change and they will change often. And so if you put it into statutes that define specific API specifications, I believe that will lead to stagnant and insecure communications because the information in this space changes very quickly. And if that's the case, then I believe that the Division of Banking is probably more apt to be able to deal with those changes very quickly as well.
Yeah, I share your exact thoughts when the commissioner testified to the extent of, we'd have to roll this out to really see what banks are interested, what it looks like in order to begin to really craft rules around it. I think that's right. And the legislative process just it's not year round. So our ability to respond to that, I think, is a lot different than the commissioner's ability to draft those rules on a as you go basis on the ground, understanding what it looks like as it's put into practice.
I would agree.
So, I guess going back to your comment of the bank's concerns of who is the regulator and what does it look like? Well, I think we all know who the regulator is. That's the Division of Banking, and what it's going to look like is going to depend on their rulemaking authority. Nothing that changes with this bill draft. if we don't want to legislate what the rules are, then we all have to just, it seems like we're all simply agreeing that we're going to leave that up to the banking division to determine what those rules would look like.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree. I guess my only concern is that in the way that the bill is drafted, what is being open, what is considered open banking? That may, in fact, may be something more for the legislature to deal with, as defined as whether this is something just as counsel for the Division of Banking was saying, you talk about aggregators or what have you, that maybe there needs to be a little bit more definition into those things as to what the different roles of the different providers have. And exactly what portions of open banking are we talking about? Is it just the aggregators, like I mentioned, like LifeLock or whatever, or are we dealing with somebody that can actually initiate third-party payments?
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer, I can certainly understand your concerns. I think, as you mentioned, and as Commissioner Bishop mentioned, there are a lot of moving parts with CFPB and some of these other entities that these banks, these governing entities have to deal with, certainly at the federal level. I think it's just worth emphasizing that if we do get something into statute and subsequent rule changes, new rulings, et cetera, come out that would require us to come back and change the statute, I think that's something certainly that this committee is more than willing to do, and to work with you and work with some of these speedies and with the banking or Division of Banking to make sure that we are compliant and congruent with some of these consumer data protections.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, I completely agree. And I think that's why, maybe making sure that from a statutory standpoint, you have definitions out there, but maybe they need to be loose enough. The Division of Banking can move very quickly as opposed to having it go through two different committees with the legislature and then get onto the floor and get through two different chambers. So I agree with you 100%.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer, I have a couple of similar questions. And the first is, would you say that this legislation as drafted stops any of our state chartered banks from doing what they do now? In other words, is it going to hold back any of our institutions and preclude them from their current business model or business practices?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I believe that that at least from the Wyoming Community Bank standpoint, it will cause people to pay attention to it a little bit, but I don't see anybody making any changes, only because they won't know what is required until they see whatever either the Division of Banking or the CFPB comes out with, or any other federal regulations, whether it's the FDIC or anybody else that, the Federal Reserve, anybody that comes up with any rules. My guess is that once the CFPB comes out with it, the rest of the federal agencies will adopt them. And so similar would be the Division of Banking. But right now, at this point in time, I think there's just enough uncertainty that most community banks, if not all of them, will be very hesitant to jump onto this without having an enormous amount of legal work done to make sure that whatever the agreements are that the customer signs off, that they know what is there and what's not, and know that there may be insecure communications happening that could potentially put their data at risk.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, another follow-up on that. So assuming that it doesn't hold anyone back, which I'm glad to hear, do you feel that right now Wyoming state chartered banks would feel comfortable fully engaging in an open banking approach, or would they require statutory changes or additional legislation before they would feel comfortable? And I certainly understand what you're saying, that they might not feel comfortable right away, but would you say that they believe they have the statutory authority to engage fully in open banking without statutory revision?
Well, that's Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. That's a little bit difficult question for me, but I do think that The language as written right there at least opens the door and we have the ability to have that communication. But I don't believe that your community banks at this point in time will probably engage in much more than providing that third party vendor with like access, like I said, with Intuit or Plaid or LifeLock or what have you. They already do that, but I'm not sure they were willing to step out of that at some point in time, if only because of the risk of the PR nightmare. If they do engage in this and that data gets made available and it's breached, then they will look at this as we will probably catch most of the brunt on that. So I think that right now, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think that they're going to be very hesitant to step much further than where they are.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, I mean, the intent of my questions really are just, I want to make sure that if we're going down this path, that we don't do anything that would hinder existing business practices or hold back our community banks from doing what they've currently been doing. And it sounds like you're comfortable with that. And I do understand that not everyone would necessarily adopt open banking, but again, beginning to walk down that path and create opportunity for those that want to utilize the opportunity without having any requirements to use that opportunity or take advantage of that opportunity if there's no desire to do so. I think states well, as you've laid out, that what we're currently working with in this bill draft. And it sounds like we're threading the needle, at least for a first bill draft, appropriately, where although you don't feel that any banks will necessarily take advantage of this immediately, we're not doing any harm through this legislation of trying to open the door to open banking. Is that fair?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I would agree with you. As I mentioned earlier, I think the devil's always going to be in the details, but what will drive this is our customers. And if the customers want this, then the banks will figure out a way to make it work. But I don't see anything in the bill right now that would make me say you can't do this at all.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, one more question.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Is there anything that is not in the bill that you think would be sufficiently strengthening that we would want it in the first draft? And again, recognizing that I don't think we're intending to roll this out quickly, so we'll have another opportunity probably to strengthen once we understand a little bit more of the lay of the land. But if we do proceed with this legislation and we're working it in the upcoming legislative session, is there anything that we're missing in your view that we would certainly want as a protection or allowance that's not here right now?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I don't know that I can think of anything other than, and then the question always comes in whether that be in rulemaking, but other than just making sure we have appropriate definitions. Like I say, the definition is currently in the bill draft is pretty broad. And so whether you have a definition of in there of what is, what are payment initiation services or account information services, or what is an aggregator or what have you, that might give the commissioner more direction. I would think would strengthen the bill, but again, that's one of those things where I'm not sure whether that should be done in legislation or whether that should be in rulemaking, because there will be constantly having new systems, new products being offered by fintech or whoever. I do know that there's a lot of the other legislation that we've looked at, and including even in the banking rules and what have you, or the banking statutes, there is a list of definitions. And so my thinking is that maybe that might be a little bit easier to have in there if it's codified as to what these definitions are. But that's the only thought I have.
Committee, additional questions for the Banking Association? All right, Mr. Meyer, we appreciate you zooming in and giving us some of your time to work through this possible bill draft.
Thank you, committee.
Do we have any public comment online?
Mr. Chairman, we have Mr. Lindholm online.
Mr. Lindholm.
Heard of him.
What about in the room? Who will be publicly testifying on this bill? Raise your hand if you would like to offer public comment. All right.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Mr. Lindholm, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate the opportunity. I'm not speaking on behalf of Senator Lummis or Senator Lummis's office, just speaking on behalf of me, for whatever that's worth. I don't represent a bank or anything like that, but I do enjoy solid legislation that I think threads a pretty nice and neat needle. Mr. Meyer talked about not being too definitive with definitions, and I think he's spot on. I think that legislation or this legislation gets to it. I don't think you want to define an API or anything like that, or define any certain type of database. And the legislation seems to be everything that I've read in it. As long as I've got the most up-to-date draft, it's not defined in there. So I think you thread that needle, and then also providing for the extra time for the banking division to write rules. I guess that'd be up to the committee as far as whether you think that's an appropriate amount of time or not. I don't know. I don't know what it would take to write rules around this. But I do think it's one of those deals, kind of like our financial sandbox that we did back in the day. It might be a complete dud, Mr. Chairman. This bill might waste all of your time. But that's all it's going to do is waste time, because there's no appropriation, there's no money here. So you might waste some people's time, but you're not going to waste anybody's money. And as Mr. Meyer testified to, some of his larger bank members might actually take advantage of this in some of the bigger towns of Wyoming. And any kind of economic opportunity, I think, provided to Wyoming businesses is a good opportunity. That's my opinion on your legislation, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lindholm, what about the definition of open banking? Do you see room for adjustment to that? I mean, we talked about the data aggregator, but beyond that, do you see room for adjustment to narrow that in or broaden it?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're exceptionally broad right now. I mean, essentially the entire definition means providing access to customer data from a customer's bank to a third-party financial service provider, and it goes on to the consent portion. But essentially all of that is what I just stated is the actual definition. So providing access, and you don't define how that access is given. It is a very broad statement, Mr. Chairman. The only thing, I guess, and I agree with Mr. Meyer on this, Mr. Chairman, the only thing that I think might be worth looking at would be on page 3, lines 2 through 5. I'm not sure that that's completely necessary, because a bank is already mandated under Title 13 that they have to comply with all applicable federal and state laws and regulations. So that Title 13 already drives over that bus several times, and it's pretty onerous. So I think this is just, maybe if legislators and your fellow members need a warm fuzzy, that's meritable, but otherwise it's just adding language that's really not necessary.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I feel like I'm comfortable with a warm fuzzy, Mr. Lindholm. I feel really good about it. Mr. Chairman, if I can ask Mr. Lindholm, anything else that you see though with regard to the provisions? The only thing that we have in here right now as sort of draft 1 is a requirement that there's express written consent to opt in, and we talked about that, and that's something that I think we all agree is a good concept. Anything else that you contemplate from your work or what you're seeing as probables from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or from any other best practices that we might want to have in this 1.0 build?
Mr. Chairman, one of the biggest concerns with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and something that they've testified on quite a bit is ensuring that customer data is protected at all times. Now, the banking institutions have probably one of the largest takes as far as customer data known to any other private entity. And they get those provisions from the Banking Secrecy Act, and then through the amended version of the Banking Secrecy Act in 2001 and 2020. And that take is mandated by the federal government. They have to they have to go after that information to ensure that individuals are who they say they are. So it's kind of the double-edged sword. So as far as protecting that data, though, as far as mandated by the federal government, they've done one of the better jobs out of financial institutions out there as far as banks are concerned. I'm not going to speak for all financial institutions because there's been some financial institutions that have not done such a good job. And to protect my own self, because I'm testifying as myself, I'm not going to name those names. But I'm certain, Mr. Chairman, that you know who I'm talking about. So I do think it does thread that needle because they do have to meet those KYC AML provisions already. And a lot of that are those financial provisions that ensure an individual's identity is protected. So you can lean back on Title 13 and the BSA knowing that those provisions will protect the consumer without putting it into your own bill and putting it into statute again, regardless of warm fuzzy. Unless the committee so chooses to do so. And if they were to choose to do so, then it would be worthwhile to probably look at Title 13 and do a copy and paste job from the provisions that already exist.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Stitt.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lindholm, how would you respond to Mr. Meyer's concerns that the financial service providers or data aggregators who might be accessing this data, that we don't have a good way of regulating their security protocols? That is, APIs are subject to cybersecurity attacks, and then the customer is going to be unhappy with their local bank for having subjected them to this misfortune and identity theft, whatnot. How would you respond to Mr. Meyer's concern on that front?
Well, I think to Mr. Meyer's concerns on that front, Mr. Chairman, through you, I think he actually answered that when he stated that there's already third-party vendor providers that do work with a lot of banks, such as Plaid and Swift and those types of entities, who are already under strict scrutiny through their banking partners and are regulated through their banking partners. So I think that opportunity to regulate them is already well in place, and this just provides that same opportunity that some of the larger banks or some of the banks that have been able to utilize capital to move into this market, such as Silvergate, is a really good example of a good example that they've taken those opportunities to work with third-party vendors across the United States and across the world, and have been able to take their small little community bank to a New York Stock Exchange traded company, and have been very successful in doing so. I wouldn't say that they're a good comparative on open banking unto itself, but I would say they're a good comparative as far as third party being regulated through them.
Committee, additional questions for Mr. Lindholm? All right. Thank you, Mr. Lindholm. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
See if we can get some warm fuzzy done today. Warm fuzzy. All right. Closing public comment. Committee, what is your pleasure on the bill? Moved by Representative Western,
Second.
seconded
Discussion.
by Co-Chairman Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman,
Discussion on the bill.
the question I have is, we could pass it out today, I think, assuming there's enough support, be interested in making sure the committee is comfortable with it. It's a short bill. If there's any revision, we could look at it next time. I do think it's going to end up going through some, a long process. I think it's important that we keep the long date and the long runway to do that. So I'm not uncomfortable moving it forward at this point in time and potentially amending it, tweaking it during the legislative session. But there's basically two ways we can go. If we want to bring it back for the next meeting, we can do so, or we can move on right now. What do you think?
I think, Mr. Co-Chairman, that if conceptually the committee is interested in pursuing the conversation on the idea, I would suggest maybe moving this bill forward to, I guess if we sponsor it today, we won't have any discussion on it in our next meeting.
So talk about it, but we'll be done with the bill. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think legalistically, it's not it's not complicated at all. I think it's more of the concept of what we're trying to accomplish and whether the committee has the drive to do that. Representative Stitt?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would prefer to have until next meeting to finalize the language because I think there are some things that we would want to have amended, I believe, ranging from the one Mr. Hopkinson pointed out concerning replacing the word releasing on line 6, page 3 with, I believe it was providing access to. And then I would think also on page 3, lines 10 through 13, we might want to flesh out a little bit more in response to the commissioner's comments. We might want to flesh out a little bit more of the guidelines of what we want the commission to actually be doing with the rules, including a reference, I would think, to cybersecurity. I would think that'd be something we would want to be giving direction to the agency about. So I'd prefer if we have some time to think of it as opposed to voting on it, passing it out today, I think might short circuit the discussion.
Okay, sensing the will of the committee to move this bill forward to amend that motion to just simply move the bill forward to the next committee meeting. Okay,
I'm good with it.
can we do that, Mr. Hopkinson? Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Hopkinson.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to remind the committee, this would have to go in front of minerals if it were to be sponsored. And their last meeting is October 27th and 28th,
Really?
prior to
Oh,
this
that-
committee's
That
next.
seems oddly early.
It
Well,
is
Mr.
obligated.
Chairman,
We don't go to session until January. Go ahead, Representative Stitt.
Mr. Chairman, given the tight timeline and requirement that it go in front of the Minerals Committee, I wouldn't mind if we work the bill and pass out something that they can consider and they can wordsmith it further.
Okay, sounds like we're going back to Representative Western, your original motion. One of the, it seems like there's a couple of obvious amendments to this then. The first is just simply page 3, line 6, deleting, releasing, and replacing with providing access to. Okay,
I'll make that motion.
it's moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? Okay. Now what about the open banking definition? Mr. Co-Chairman and the aggregate? What about the aggregate?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not comfortable advocating for
toward-
that change yet. Financial service provider, third-party financial service provider. When you have it as a financial service provider, you have a lot of there's a lot of connotation to that. There's a lot of required regulation, and we know that regardless of how this turns out and what the rules and regulations are going to be, that it will be a financial service provider at the end of the day, and therefore all the consumer protections that go along with that phrase are going to be heaped on. So we can be comfortable with that. I don't know what data aggregator really means enough to know that it would be protected. And so this is one of those things that I'd feel a lot more comfortable knowing what the implications of it was before going in front of the Minerals Committee and trying to explain that we should support a data aggregator as being something that could handle data when I don't necessarily know what that is. So there's a lot of protection on the words financial service provider. And I think if we're moving something along to the Minerals Committee for consideration, again, knowing that there's a long road ahead on this piece of legislation in terms of developing everything out, I'd want it to be built in a way that is sort of secure as we're building it up.
Representative Yin, do you think the 1 year rulemaking timeframe, July 2024 is enough time?
I think it's better that we push it back than we keep it. With giving them that full year is a good idea.
Okay.
And it will help come back. It will allow them to also come back to us if they have any issues with drafting those rules and regulations, especially with this definition, et cetera, that we'll be able to hear them again within that following year.
Okay. All right, any other suggestive changes then, committee? Everyone comfortable with the process? Sounds like we'll be going to Minerals Committee in October.
Minerals. Yeah.
Oh, wait, you'll already be there.
Sure, I'll be there, and that good representative right there, Representative Western will be there.
I won't even need to be there. This is perfect. All right. Do a roll call on the bill.
Senator Furphy. Senator Cost,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott. Representative Stiff,
Aye.
Representative Western. Representative Yin,
Aye.
Co-Chairman Rothfuss. Chairman Olson.
Aye.
That passes.
Dows. Mr. Hopkinson, we have 23 LSO 0158. Also a version 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, walking through 23 LSO 158, working draft 0.4, decentralized autonomous organization amendments. This comes before the committee based on the request from the previous meeting. Specifically, that we provide a definition for publicly available identifier and a requirement that the articles of organization be amended when that publicly available identifier has changed. And that's what the bill draft does. On the next page, we see that definition for publicly available identifier. This definition comes in part from some language out of Tennessee, which is best as I can tell. They took our Dow statute, tweaked it a bit, made it law there, and they included the definition publicly available identifier that frankly, I then tweaked it a little bit, and that's what we see here. So that new language is added, providing that definition, and then of course, requiring in that other section down on lines 15 and 16 that the articles of organization be amended when that identifier has changed. And with that, I'd stand for any questions on this bill.
That's what we asked for. That is exactly what we asked for, including the Wyomingized version of the Tennessee definitions. We do appreciate you being very cognizant that we would not want to have a definition that wasn't Wyomingized. Okay, thank you, Mr. Hopkinson.
Good.
Deputy Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Karen Wheeler, Deputy Secretary of State, and I can keep my comments very short. But Mr. Chairman, first I would like to answer a question from this morning from Mr. Co-Chairman. I have your statistics on entities that were dissolved, LLCs that were dissolved in last fiscal year. Domestic LLCs that were administratively dissolved for not having filed their annual reports or failing to have a registered agent were 40,393. 5,839 domestic LLCs filed articles of dissolution. And then foreign LLCs, we had 644 that were revoked for not filing their annual report or failing to maintain a registered agent. And then we had 274 foreign LLCs that filed articles of withdrawal. Welcome. So, Mr. Chairman, as far as the Dow Amendment Bill, I was thrilled to see the Wyoming version of the Tennessee language. I did look at the Tennessee bill when it came out, and I did like that language a lot. So we're great with this.
Deputy Wheeler, I believe it was 19 Dows administratively dissolved for no public identifier. Is that
I
what you-
would have to grab my other note,
whatever
but
the
I
number-
think that's correct.
The number doesn't matter. Whatever the number was, are we moving in the right direction of trying to address some of those deficiencies, do you think?
And Mr. Chairman, yes, we are. And that was the problem that we were having is Dows were not listing a public identifier and we had no recourse to require them to do so. So this is helping. Thank you.
Perfect. Committee? Questions? All right. Thank you, Deputy Wheeler.
Thank you.
Public comment online? Let him in.
And Daza.
And Daza.
All right, good.
You can go ahead and let them both in. Welcome, Brendan.
Hello, welcome committee. Can everybody hear me? See
We
me?
sure can.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Thank you very much, Co-Chair Rothfuss and Co-Chair Olson and committee. My name is Brendan Marr. I am a MIT Media Laboratory alumnus from 1993. I am on the digital identity working groups and the working groups for DAOs and data privacy. And what I'd like to do is address the statute language proposed for the Dow Amendment and provide some information that might be useful for modifying this or making plans going forward. So I should just say I'll try to be as succinct as I can. What I'd like to do is I'd like to set the precedent and establish that first and foremost, this topic is much bigger than the simple language in the fix. Actually, the language in the fix is fine for the moment, but it will need to be changed, and I'll get into that. The most important thing here is that this idea of public identifiers and private identifiers is much bigger, and it is critical that this be at least kept alive so that we can work on these issues that I will outline in a few moments. But so a little bit of context. So I had just received the draft last week of draft 4. The working group and the legislation has been very busy with the midterm elections, and we actually didn't get it till very recently. So we really haven't had a chance to work through the issues, although we've been talking about a lot of these things for quite some time now. It's very apparent to me that when I started to look into this bill draft, that the fundamental thing that's missing is the idea that public identifiers in this draft point to smart contracts. And it has been corrected that they should be pointers, dynamic things that will point to the current smart contract. And that's all great. The problem, however, is that this idea of public identifiers is much larger than simply a public identifier that points to a smart contract of an operating agreement. Right? There are all sorts of public identifiers for companies, for entities, for organizational identities, for individuals. There are public identifiers around digital identity. There's ones around registered names. There's names in that ilk for series names. There's token symbols. There's digital assets. There's brands. There's wallet addresses. There's domain names. Titles. Basically, a public identifier used by an entity or an individual can be appointed to anything, and this is something that is very important to resolve. So, with that said, the language is too narrow, and no matter what we do, we're going to have to come back to it. And there are some very, very important things to consider as to why we're going to need to look at the deeper issues here that we've been talking about for a number of years. Now, those deeper issues come down to this idea of this pointer, this public identifier, this identifier, right, which may be public, it may be eventually a private identifier. But we're going to need one place in statute where we deal with some of the issues that are specific to this. And to shed some light on some of these issues, so you get a feeling of what needs to be worked on, is this idea that you have an identifier, which is represented as a 0, X, and then some number of characters, which represents a hexadecimal digit. And these things point to other data, right? So the fundamental problem is that we have in Web 2, we have something called domain names. So there's a whole orchestration of bodies that will resolve domain names. So text is resolved to an IP address, and you point to something, and everybody understands this. The problem when we move into the Web 3 space is that these pointers, they are not resolved or resolvable in any kind of standard way. So you can have one of these addresses, and they can be something that points to a blockchain address that can receive funds or can send funds. It could be a smart contract address. It could be represented as a CID, which is a content identifier, which is used pervasively in Web3, which is a form of a hash. And that can point to any data. And it could be data which is always the same, it's static or it's dynamic. But the salient point here is that this idea about resolving becomes really, really important when we talk about things like, is the thing pointed to the registered name of a company or a brand? Well, what happens if it changes? So there's some things that we're going to, this is not big stuff. We've been talking about it for quite some time, but there's a little bit of boundary language that we're going to need on the statute side to firm this up. The other salient point is around these ideas about, as I mentioned in the June meeting, about extortion, and when you have addresses that are blockchain addresses that give away information, public information, where you're buying public information that is not associated with a blockchain address, and that gets leaked, that could lead to issues of extortion and all sorts of bad privacy kinds of things, which I spoke of in the June meeting. But really where we're going with all this is this idea about what we already have in the Digital Identity Act, is this idea of principal authority, right? Demonstration of principal authority, of control, using a key to demonstrate principal authority that, using, are you with me? Oh, okay. Using a key to demonstrate principal authority over digital identity. And these ideas of attestation, over these digital identifiers, and being able to cryptographically make proofs of things. And these proofs are not necessarily a legal proof. So there's some clarity that will be needed there. I'll stop. I got one or two just for small private recommendations, but I'll take a pause for anyone who has some questions at this time.
Well, why don't you just, we'd actually love, if those recommendations deal with this definition, we'd love to have them.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Yes, oh, go ahead.
I guess we do. We actually have a question. Representative Western, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Meyer. So basically what I took away from what you said was that this definition is going to have trouble interacting with Web3 applications, interface, whatever. I'm not going to dare ask you what Web3 is and how that works in this context, but don't you think that retooling this to fit those types of circumstances in the future can be done at a later date?
So, yeah, I can answer that actually. there's, if I may, in answering that, I will actually get into my recommendations. So my recommendation for the Dow bill is first and foremost that we consider taking a file ID that every entity or if it's a e-resident or natural person, the file number that they have and appending that with .dow or the file ID .corp or file ID .llc. And this moves us in the direction of being able to represent the entity with the file number directly in that. And that moves us, towards this direction of where we're going to need to do these kinds of things, even without Web3, right? We're going to need to do these types of things with series LLCs. We've been talking about this for multiple years now, that there's a problem with the regulation for series LLCs on naming, where the child LLC is named with a parent name in it. And that is a problem for branding of those entities, for privacy for those entities. So, some of these ideas, some of these solutions for the Web3 stuff, we're going to need to do anyway to solve that kind of problem, which is independent of Web3. Did I answer that? I'll take a pause there, and I have one other recommendation.
Great. Any follow-up before we get to the other recommendation? All right, we're good. Go ahead with the other recommendation, Brendan.
Yes. Okay. Specifically, the other recommendation I have is that the committee consider seriously a digital identity working group, which can look at addressing these issues of the definitions and statute language pertaining specifically to digital identifiers. It is the case that I have, kind of discussed this with a number of other people, including Desert Greenwood, who's on the line, who will also be probably speaking further, and David Pope, who also agreed to be initial members for this. Really, this is not, that much different than what we've already been. So many of the issues that we've already been working at for several years here with digital identity. This is just the next step. But what the purpose really of the working group in part, it really, I don't care what you call it. I've been saying for years that we're going to need a computational law act. Maybe it's a digital identifiers act. It doesn't matter what you call it. But this is just a signal to the committee that there's going to be some statute language which will be needed to firm up some of these ideas. That's my recommendation there. So we can either put the Dow Amendment forward as it is, knowing that we're going to modify it. Maybe we're going to have to modify it in November, but we most certainly will have to modify it. And my third and final comment goes back to Representative Olson's affinity for the metaverse when we started this today. At some point, it is going to be clear to everybody, and I've been saying this for years. I was a pioneer in virtual reality in 1993. I was one of the first 150 people in the world developing virtual reality, as you all know. It's going to be very, very clear that that whole thing, right, is not going to be addressable by domain names. It's just not going to work that way, right? Because there's too much stuff being generated dynamically at scale. So if we're going to have registered names and other things that are identifiers for things in, the metaverse and other things, we're going to need to start to have to resolve these things in some of these kinds of ways. That's all I have to say, and I'll certainly answer any other questions if the committee has them.
Thank you, Brendan. I think you've helped us to key into what we, and I won't speak for the whole committee, but I think this definition needs some more work, and we're keying into that based on your discussion. So we're very cognizant of that, and where we go from here, we'll figure that out, but it will probably take another meeting to get us where we want to be on that. Let's see what Daza has to say.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thanks, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you, members of the committee. I'm Daza Greenwood, and I'm here in my MIT capacity today if it's in scope, and I should ask this of the chair first, it's basically to provide a quick, to let you know about some research that we're starting this semester on the Dow LLC statute that follows up on the algorithmic manager part of the statute. It'll be short, but I don't know that it's necessarily in scope for the identifier topic.
No, this is a good time for that, Daza. Thanks.
Thank you. So very quickly, we are launching a research project at law.mit.edu this year, this semester actually, on the Wyoming Dow LLC project, and particularly is to explore some of the issues and the options with the Dow LLC algorithmic manager part of the statute. And it's especially in the context where some activities under this legal entity will be happening off-chain, not completely under a smart contract. And that'll be happening in commerce or other parts of the economy. So specifically, we're going to be looking to test the capacity of some example Dow LLC algorithms to correctly perform fiduciary duties that are owed by managers of Wyoming LLCs to other members and to the entity itself under section 17-29-409 of the Wyoming statutes covering standards of conduct for members and managers. The idea that we had was to take the standardized tests that lawyers, for example, have to take to show competence to understand and correctly apply the fiduciary duties of care and loyalty, which are the two that the Wyoming statutes require of LLC managers. It's known as the MPRE, the multi-state professional responsibility exam, and possibly also the fiduciary rule exams that financial advisors are required to take. And basically, we've got an idea to create a test harness to see how good or not good a job some of these algorithms are able to do on these tests, and hopefully learn from it and see, we'll just basically see what we see. What we expect is that there may be a gap between what some of these algorithms are able to do and what we would expect of a human manager of an LLC, and that maybe there'll be some learning from that that could help be an input to the committee in further amendments down the line for the statute, perhaps ensuring more human control for the types of activities that would require typically fiduciary duties, or maybe limiting the scope of activities such an entity could do, or something else, or maybe just kind of going for it in view of the fact that it's a new innovation that you want to encourage. But anyway, we'd at least like to start to clarify what these things can and can't do as against the criteria expected of humans for similar LLCs in Wyoming under Wyoming law. And that's what we're doing. We hope that it will be helpful to you. And if you have any questions, well, I should say, if you want to see the research, it's actually on a blog post now at civics.com. And if you click on the blog and scroll down, there's an algorithmic entity and fiduciary duties post. And soon, in a week or two, we'll have a research page at law.mit.edu as well. we'd welcome any feedback, questions or concerns the committee may have on this.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for bringing that to our attention, and that's a fascinating research, and it does get into then a little bit about this public available identifier concept and the fact that you're going to need to have something which is sufficient to link to that you can actually run that research on. And I think it's almost a good test case circumstance where if you can't find what you need to find to run your research, then it's probably an insufficient public identifier with regard to what we're looking for statutorily. So I think we'll really look forward to hearing how things turn out for you on that. And I'll stop there, but we really appreciate your work on that, Daza.
Representative Stiff? No,
Mr. Chairman, I just thought if Mr. Greenwood was working on an algorithm to take an ethics exam, if he could design one that would take an ethics exam for me.
You'll stand by, we'll try to make this one work first, and who knows, if it does work. It's funny, I talked to someone from, I shouldn't name the company, but from a company that provides exam support software, as we're trying to understand better how to calibrate these exams and how to apply them in this new context. And they said the same thing. Wow, this would make a great product. So you never know where this research is going to go, but what I hope is that the results will be useful first and foremost for the committee.
As I don't think you know quite what you're getting into by designing that for Representative Stiff, but Mr. Reveal, no? Okay. All right. Committee? Any additional public comment? Yes, please come forward.
Mr. Chairman, David Duccini, founder of Silicon Prairie Holdings, Inc., financial technology company in the blockchain space. We operate nominally as a funding portal, broker dealer, transfer agent, and hopefully soon an alternative trading system. My only comment is this, that I think as codified, a URI, a Uniform Resource Indicator, is more than sufficient to act as a public identifier. The URI, if you recall, does include a component of it that involves the protocol that's being cited. And I think that with a, and this is used by mobile apps, and I think having some nominal requirement that the URI include the protocol would at least provide some guidance to where that, that hex address might actually live. That's it. Questions?
Representative Western? Well, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll say that, as I was trying to toy with some language and some changes, it was kind of down the same avenue that you're talking about, where we had uniform resource locator in here, going with the indicator and incorporating language that suggests what protocol we're actually looking to or where we're looking. It sounds relatively complete and probably accomplishes what we are looking for better than what we have written, although we probably then also need a little bit of language about the fact that it's pointing to the governing smart contract, something along those lines, the information that we need to have pursuant to statute. So I appreciate that concept, particularly the idea of indicating the protocol as a point to emphasize. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that that protocol could also be, human meat space, right? It could be an indicator that pointed to a registration number at a Secretary of State's office. Right. Though, even though there is, the IANA, configuration for specific protocols like HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, even having, a nominal Ethereum : / hex address would be super helpful. Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Great, thanks. You're not surprised, Tennessee. Any other public testimony? All right, close public comment. Committee. Moved by Representative Yin. Seconded by Representative Western. Co-chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I think we're in the ballpark of a good answer, and I think honestly, we could potentially work this legislation tomorrow if we had an opportunity to doodle it a little bit, come up with the appropriate phrasing that's consistent with uniform resource indicator with reference to protocol that identifies a smart contract address. We could try and work through it right now, and maybe Representative Ian has a concept. So I'll see if we can get to that point, but I do believe we have to go that route instead of, you know, I'm uncomfortable with a published white paper, for example, as just being the destination. I understand what the folks in Tennessee were going for. We struggle with the same thing, but at the end of the day, the statute that we're working within requires that you have certain information available publicly for governance related to your smart contract governance. And if you don't have those things that you can point to, then I don't know how we're checking the box that it is going to fulfill any of the rest of the obligations they have under statute. So I like this approach.
Representative Ian.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So uniform resource identifier and uniform resource locator are specific terms of art when it comes to technology. They're defined in IETF RFCs, so standard organization with standardized terms. Uniform resource locator is very specific, so it's for a specific unique address where you would find something. So I think URL is actually the appropriate term here. I'm also less comfortable with white paper because I don't think it really defines an actual implementation of a DAO. It more defines a definition of a DAO. So the difference between, I don't know if anyone's a programmer, the difference between like a class and an object. The object is the DAO, right? The white paper is just a definition of how you could implement one. So I'd probably strike white paper. I think the definition is also open enough where it's got May language and it allows the similar item language, where if the Secretary of State needed flexibility, it's there. But I think also the intent of the definition is for us to be able to find through a filing where a DAO is actually located because it is intended to be public. And I do agree that there are probably ways where we need to work on implementing what is a publicly available identifier. But I think in the context of the DAO LLC, which this is what it applies to, it says in the top of the bill, as in this chapter, because it's applying specific to the DAO LLC, it is important to understand the intent of the legislature here in making the definition here. So I don't think the definition needs to be super broad here. Basically, the definition is just guidance to the Secretary of State to understand what is or is not acceptable as a publicly available identifier. And I think the language as given is good, but I'll make an amendment if that's okay.
Representative Yin, in the first part of the definition, does the public identifier or does the address identify the smart contract or point to the smart contract?
The address is in it. I mean, that's a good question. So does your postal address identify your home or is it an address to your home? I mean, I think that is whether it's important or not of a distinction. I don't know.
What's your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, so there'd be two. One is to fulfill the concern that Senator Rothfuss, the co-chairman, has of striking published white paper. So I'll just make that motion separately. To strike published white paper.
Seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 All those opposed? All right, that was a good amendment.
And the other one is just a slight drafting error. My apologies to Mr. Hopkinson, but the accurate spelling would be locator with 2 O's and no E. And because it's a specific term of art, I think it's important to reduce that ambiguity. So just make the drafting change. Locator, LOCATOR.
Second.
Okay. Sounds like a unanimously adopted
Yeah.
typographical change.
And I say aye. And Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Getting into the structure of it, though, the concern I had was that means an address that is available publicly, that's all good, and that identifies a smart contract, also good. and may include a uniform resource locator. It almost seems like, in getting back to the discussion we had with Mr. Sheena a second ago, that we would want uniform resource locator or identifier, whichever one we choose, and I'm fine with locator if you feel the preference there. But that's what you would want, in my view, instead of the word address, because it's literally the type of address we're looking for.
Or other similar item.
Yeah, you could have or other similar item. But that's my question. So I'd ask Representative Yin his thoughts on that. Switching around the structure means a uniform resource locator that is publicly available or available publicly, and that identifies a smart contract. To me, it seems like that's almost a sufficient definition.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think the reason that it's in that list, URL or contract address, is because the contract address could just point to a place on a blockchain where you don't necessarily need both a URL and a contract address. So could
So
a
a direct
URL point,
address.
the URL could point to a contract address, which would still be the same thing.
It seems like
Fair.
it's the structure of the sentence that you struggle with. I mean, really what you're saying is means, instead of saying an address, it just means a URL, contract address, or other similar item
Yeah,
that is available.
Mr. Chairman, I guess after Representative Yin's discussion, I can see where the intent here is that address is giving two possible options. One is the smart contract address, sort of as a static address in the blockchain, and the other would be a URL version of an abstraction of that address. So I see it.
Well, I think it has to
that's the
mean,
intent.
I think it has to mean something more, Representative Yin, because it may include this list. So what would be an example, Representative Yin, of an address that did not include a URL or a contract address?
Well, so I think you could have a contract address, right? So that's just a location on a blockchain. You could have a URL, which is, I mean, it could either specifically point to, be a pointer that ends up pointing to a contract address, or it could be a web page that describes the DAO and has the contract address in its list, its blockchain address in its list. Are you asking what could be something else that would be an address?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are plenty of other possibilities in the blockchain space that could fulfill that. But I think that those two would probably be the most used options, which is why I think or similar item is a good
So I think
option.
policy wise, in the structure of this sentence, what we have to be comfortable with is if it does not include the URL or the contract address, but it is somehow available publicly, do we believe that is sufficient? And not knowing exactly what the infinite possibilities are, I don't know. Can you say that you're comfortable with that? Because the first, and I think that goes back to Senator Rothfuss's structure of the sentence. It may include the URL or the contract address. It doesn't have to. It can just be an address that's available publicly, period. And that satisfies the definition, right? And what is that? And are we comfortable with that?
So I think this is, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a kind of a semantic question. So you're saying I mean, maybe the change would just be which may include.
No witches in the wild
That's right. Okay, so I mean, basically, we want to define this as the possible content of what an address is, would be either a URL or a contract address.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Provide us a little insight.
You gotta just push that little
Yeah.
button, light it up.
Gotta-
Okay,
There you
hi,
go.
I'm Pamela Norton. I'm the CEO and founder of Title Chain. I have a couple of points. I'll cover a lot tomorrow in my address or my time, but I think if you reference on-chain and off-chain, that would cover sort of these 2 points that you're talking about, because the reference of that locator for the contract could be either on-chain or off-chain. I think there's also some language that needs to be incorporated around archiving the data and ensuring, so what's happening right now when if you're hashing or you're referencing a contract on, let's say it's IPFS, like it's a very fragile system right now. So that's how links are all of a sudden disappearing. So we need to ensure that there's language around the storage or the reference of that smart contract or that record of events that happened is archived either on an AWS. So, there's third-party storage that can be decentralized stored. So I think storage is really critical, that there's a way that from a legal or regulatory perspective, that if you need to do any sort of investigation or whatever, that those archive documents are secure and encrypted for the entity. So. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
So Senator Nethercott and I were just whispering some concepts, and one of them hit upon what we just heard, which is, or other similar item, changing the word item to reference. And at that point, we have two concepts of references above. We've got an address of a smart contract, or we've got a URL, and then it would be our other similar reference. And I think that helps go down the right path of phrasing that's appropriate. And again, it might not be perfect, but Representative Yin has convinced me that it's not as far off as I thought it was. I'm a lot happier with it now.
Okay, good. And it's been moved and seconded by Senator Nethercott.
Yeah. Well, and Mr. Chairman, I would make the motion.
Oh,
then
no,
that-
you moved it. Sorry.
I
you
know,
moved
but
it.
this is an amendment. I'm
You're
moving
gonna
to
amend or?
amend item to reference.
Oh, thank you. Okay, it's been officially moved by Co-Chairman Rothfuss.
Yes, it has.
Based on that discussion with Senator Rothfuss or Senator Nethercott, I'm assuming she will second that. Yeah, it's a brilliant amendment. Discussion?
Question.
No question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we're getting closer.
Let's just leave it alone.
Turns out we feel good about it now?
I feel great.
All right. Okay. Roll call on the bill.
Senator Furphy excused, Senator Cost,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott. Representative Stiff,
Aye.
Representative Western. Representative Yin,
Aye.
Co-Chairman Rothfuss,
Aye.
Chairman Olson,
Aye.
that passes.
All right.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, please.
I just wanted to confirm that I captured all of the amendments.
Okay.
One was to strike or delete published white paper. The other is to change item to reference, and then finally to change or to correct spelling of locator. Those were the only amendments made. Is that
You
correct?
got it.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Tennessee.
So let's just go back. real quick.
You want to go back? Okay.
Mr. Co-Chairman, can you walk me through the elements associated with satisfying what this statute would require for having a publicly available identifier? Because I do think that the challenge is the structure of the bill draft from a legal perspective. When reading through it, Representative Stiff, focus in, is there a smarter way to do it? So publicly available identifier means an address that is available publicly, one, right? And that identifies a smart contract, two, and may include one of the following.
It's at least the first two. Yeah.
It's at least the first two. Is there a smarter way to structure that
That,
structurally?
that's kind of where I was, that's what I was struggling
A
with.
series of ands is difficult, right?
Yeah.
And Mr. Chairman, I think we just had a vote on it, right?
We,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
we
think we're
did.
good, right?
I'm bringing it back, Representative Stiff. Good work is good work. I guess I'd ask LSO to think about that, right? Because I anticipate that will come down the pike. By me.
Okay. We, all right, we better come ready to minerals with an amendment.
We don't need this one in minerals.
Oh, this is minerals
We
one?
just- That's ours.
Oh, wow, this is ours. All right.
No minerals
Just-
for that.
Keep that one away from Senator Nethercott.
We're gonna make it better.
Okay,
A, B, and C,
next.
so that it's clear that there's 3 to 230. I'm with you.
Public benefit corporations.
time.
Do you need a break? I mean,
Yeah, it's
Yes.
5 minutes.
is that a good idea?
7 minutes. Is it a
Okay,
good idea? Probably not.
Senator Cost, this is a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
All right,
It's 4:20. It's 4:20. It's time for a break.
it's 4:20,
Time for a break.
5 minutes. All right. I will call this meeting back. And we're gonna finish strong here with our last topic, public benefit corporations. We do have a bill draft. 23 LSO 49 version 5, Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, looking at 23 LSO 49, working draft 0.5 for-profit public benefit corporations. This committee considered this bill back in 2021. It failed on third reading, I believe, in the House. It is based on Delaware law, and it provides or would allow for a for-profit public benefit corporation. So looking at that, then on page 2, got the short title in that first section, just identifying what it is. And the definitions further down, subsection 1 provides that a for-profit public benefit corporation is a corporation operated for profit and organized and subject to the requirements of this chapter that is intended to produce a public benefit and to operate in a responsible and sustainable manner. And then the last sentence there just clarifies that this does not modify public benefit corporations or in the nonprofit statutes of the Wyoming statutes. A public benefit on page 3 is identified or means that a positive effect or a reduction of negative effects on one or more categories of persons, entities, communities, or interests other than stockholders in their capacity as stockholders. And then public benefit provisions just means the provisions of the articles of incorporation required by this chapter. Article 103 provides for the applicability, provides that the Wyoming Business Corporation Act applies to for-profit public benefit corporations to the extent that they're not inconsistent with the provisions of this chapter. And provides that if any other type of corporation intends or elects to convert to a for-profit public benefit corporation, then they shall be subject to the requirements of this chapter. Article 104, beginning at the bottom of page 3, moving on to page 4, provides for what should be included in the articles of incorporation, and specifically identifies that a for-profit public benefit in their articles shall identify one or more public benefits to be promoted by the corporation and state that it is a for-profit public benefit corporation. Subsection B just provides that the name has to include either public benefit corporation or the abbreviation PBC or designation PBC, and that if it doesn't include that, then prior to issuing unissued shares of stock, that they shall provide notice to any person to whom the stock is issued or who acquires the treasury shares that it is in fact a for-profit public benefit corporation. And then at the top of page 4, that provides that notice required need not be provided if the issuance or disposal is pursuant to an offering registered under the 1933 Securities Act, or if at the time of issuance or disposal, it had a class of securities registered under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Article 105 provides that that a nonprofit corporation shall not be a constituent corporation to any merger with a for-profit public benefit corporation. And so that just provides one exclusion there, that a nonprofit cannot be converted into a for-profit public benefit corporation. The 106 there, the bottom of page 5, provides for stock certificates and notices that are required, and provides that any stock certificate issued shall conspicuously note that it is a for-profit public benefit corporation, and that as such, they are required to balance the pecuniary interests of the stockholders and the public interest identified in the corporation's articles of incorporation. Further, it requires that any notice given by a for-profit public benefit corporation pursuant to Wyoming Statute 1716-626B, which is a reference to the shares, issuing shares without certificates, that they shall state conspicuously that the corporation is a for-profit public benefit corporation. kind of the meat of the bill, I think, is it here in section 107 or Article 107, the duties of the directors. And it provides that the board of directors shall balance the pecuniary interests of the stockholders and the public benefits identified in its articles of incorporation. Section B provides that a director shall not, by virtue of the public benefit provisions, have any duty to any person on account of any interest of the person in the public benefits identified in the articles of incorporation, or on account of any interest materially affected by the corporation's conduct. And then with respect to a decision implicating that balancing requirement, that a director shall be deemed to satisfy that requirement or his fiduciary duties if the decision is both informed and disinterested, and such that the person of ordinary sound judgment would approve. Subsection C goes on to provide that a director's ownership interests or ownership of or other interest in the stock of a for-profit public benefit corporation shall not alone create a conflict of interest on the part of the director with respect to his decisions implicating the balancing requirements, except to the extent that the ownership would create a conflict of interest if the corporation were not a for-profit public benefit corporation. Subsection D then provides that in the absence of a conflict of interest, that no failure to satisfy the balancing requirements in subsection A shall, for the purposes of statutes looking at limits on liability of directors and indemnification, that it would constitute an act or omission not in good faith or a breach of the duty of loyalty unless the articles of incorporation provide for such. Article 108 on page 8 provides for required statements and provides that in every notice of a meeting of stockholders that a statement shall be made that it is a for-profit public benefit corporation formed pursuant to this chapter. Subsection B provides that for-profit public benefit corporations shall not less than annually provide its stockholders with a statement that outlines or provides information as to the corporation's promotion of the public benefits identified in its articles of incorporation, and shall include in paragraph 1 the objectives of the board of directors or the objectives that they have established to promote the public benefit and interests, the standards that the board of directors has adopted to measure the corporation's progress in promoting those benefits and interests and in meeting those objectives, and finally an assessment of the corporation's success in meeting its objectives and promoting the public benefits and interests. Subsection C provides that the articles of incorporation or bylaws may require that a corporation do any one or more of these following: that they may provide a statement previously described more frequently than annually, that they may make the statement available to the public, or that they may use a third-party standard in connection with or to attain a periodic third-party certification addressing the corporation's promotion of the public benefits identified in the articles of incorporation. Article 109 provides for the enforcement of those balancing requirements and provides that any action, well, unless otherwise agreed to by the shareholders, that any action to enforce the balancing requirements, including individual derivative or other type of proceeding, shall not be brought unless the plaintiffs own individually or collectively at least 2% of the corporation's outstanding shares, or if it's a national corporation listed on a national securities exchange, that they own the lesser of 2% of the corporation's outstanding shares, or shares with a market value of at least $2 million. And the rest of that just notes that they can't, this section doesn't relieve any other requirements of complying for a derivative proceeding, and specifies that that includes Wyoming Statute 1716-741A1, which simply provides that a shareholder, that they have to be a shareholder at the time of the act or omission alleged violation of that balancing requirement, or that there was a transfer of those shares by operation of law. Finally, Article 110 provides this chapter shall not affect any statute or rule of law applicable to a corporation that is not a for-profit public benefit corporation, except as provided in Article 105, which we saw previously. The effective date of the act is July 1st, 2023. And I would note one potential amendment for the committee to consider that I wanted to highlight, and that would be on page 23. Page 23, which doesn't exist. Page 6, line 23. And to understand this, the original drafts that the committee considered back in 2020, there were 3 things to be balanced. One was the pecuniary interest of the shareholders, one was the public benefit, but one was also the interests of any person materially affected by the corporation's actions. In November of 2022, the committee decided to get rid of that 3rd prong. And so we have here language or on account of any interests material affected by the corporation's conduct. The committee may wish to consider just deleting that language. It's kind of a holdover that frankly I missed when I was removing all the other references to any interest materially affected by the corporation's conduct. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
No questions, committee. I mean, you have seen this bill. It did pass unanimously in the Senate.
We did pretty well on that.
Did pretty well on that. And just barely fell short in the House, just a couple votes. I remember it.
Helicopter short.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Oh, Mr. Hopkinson, I did have one question actually. There, I was looking back, there was an amendment on the Senate side, one amendment. Did you look at that amendment? Is it already, did you take the engrossed version that came over from the Senate?
Mr. Chairman, I believe so. I believe that
Okay.
those Senate amendments were already incorporated.
Okay.
But I can double check.
Yeah, I didn't line it through to see its significance, but I would just want to double check on that.
I think, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
It's my recollection that was a committee amendment, if I'm not mistaken, yep, it is. It's a standing committee amendment
Oh,
that was brought as a fix, and then Senator Nethercutt.
from the corporation. This is corporations committee.
That's from the corporations committee. They did it in standing committee, and I think it was a very rational and reasonable.
Probably something that Senator
widely
Nethercutt
supported.
wrote.
It was probably Senator Nethercutt. Yeah, she probably did it.
Okay.
If it was, she doesn't remember.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Hopkinson.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, please, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Just briefly, I will reiterate the fact that this is nearly identical to the legislation that we came very close to getting across the finish line the year before last. I think that we've resolved all of the problems that held it back. Yes. If I'm not mistaken. So I think
I
we
believe
should be
they're resolved.
in a good place. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Deputy Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, Karen Wheeler, Deputy Secretary of State. In looking through this bill, the provisions that apply to our office, that is as the filing office, we have absolutely no changes to it. It can be implemented as is. That being said, to implement it, there is a fiscal impact. And I do have 2 options for you to choose from. The first option is we can make this a subtype of a profit corporation. And to do so, the fiscal impact would be $17,880. Or should you choose to have this as a brand new entity type in our system, then that fiscal impact is $45,120.
Go ahead.
And that's basically for the the corporate filing registration system and coding it up to properly reflect that. We obviously have it identified as a subtype statutorily. What would or supplement, I guess is what we call it, a supplement. So it's effectively a for-profit corporation that then opts for the supplement. How have we done that with our other supplements? Have we opted for subtype at the 18K, or have we opted for a full new category at 45?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, we've done them as subtypes. Mhm.
Sorry, Mr. Reveal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delaware Public Benefit Corporations, do we know how those are categorized, and would there be any reason that a company seeking to file or their attorneys would be less inclined to do so if it were categorized under for-profit corporations in a hierarchy?
Deputy, do you know about how Delaware categorizes it?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Reveal, I don't. And when I say it's as a subtype, when you go out on our system and you look it up, it will look just like its own entity type on the face. It's just how we configure it within our business system is all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nothing else for the Secretary of State's office? All right. Thank you, Deputy. We have any public comment online? Okay, public comment in the room? Public comment in the room. Closing public comment. Committee. What is your pleasure? Moved by Representative Yin and seconded by Senator Cost. Any amendments, Mr. Chairman? Co-chairman?
I would move the amendment suggested, bottom of page 6, strike line 23, and on to page 7, strike through the word conduct period.
Okay, moved and seconded. Representative Yin. Any other discussion on the amendment? Right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? An amendment carries. Any other amendments? Discussion on the bill? Roll call on the bill.
Senator Purphy excused, Senator Cost,
Aye.
Senator Nethercott. Representative Stiff,
No.
Representative Western. Representative Yin.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Rothfuss.
Aye.
Chairman Olson.
Aye.
That passes.
Unanimous. Okay. I believe that takes us to the end of the day.
Yes.
Mr. Hopkinson, is there anything pressing fresh on your mind that you want to get clarification on before we adjourn?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think it's been
Or
fairly
recess
straightforward
rather?
today.
Okay. Perfect. Then we will. Oh, go ahead, Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't know that Senator Rothfuss had mentioned that there was an action he wanted the committee to take with respect to a potential amicus brief that's apparently due to be filed tomorrow.
Are you okay? Okay, I was waiting until we had the committee to support it. So what, if it sounds like we have general support today, the concept is that we have the opportunity as a select committee to file an amicus brief with the case before the circuit court related to the Custodia Bank, the Custodia Speedy Bank lawsuit against the Kansas City Federal Reserve. And I think it's good opportunity for us to weigh in on the importance of the Speedy Bank being honestly treated fairly under the law, which is really what we're looking for. We have a near-term deadline. I sent a copy of the amicus brief around to the members to review, and there's a couple of possibilities, but the possibility that I most favor would be to have the select committee be the signatory of the amicus brief. And I would like that done either by unanimous consent or not done that way. And then we would have to go to individual signatures or something along those lines. I don't want to see a partial vote realistically where a portion of the select committee supports and a portion of the select committee doesn't support. I think it's important that we either do it all together. Alternatively, Co-Chairman Olson and I could be signatories, so it's certainly workable either way, but that's the concept before us.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Stiff.
and just to be clear, a couple of things. First off, it's my understanding that no Wyoming tax dollars were used in the preparation of this amicus brief.
That is correct.
And then the version that I have appears to be a draft that can use a little bit of wordsmithing. And it might be nice if they threw in a cite to some legal citations of some sort or another. What I saw was so far was argument, but I didn't see a citation to any relevant, shall we say, law, which is kind of unusual, right? To have a legal brief with no law in it. But I assume that they've still got a little less than 24 hours to remedy that.
Senator Cut.
Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. A couple of issues I would have questions for of this interesting concept. One is who is, I'm very excited to see this work being prepared to be filed in the court that advocates on behalf of the work that the Wyoming has done in this regard. I have concerns about are these lawyers representing the committee? Are we their client? The Wyoming legislature, it's only an amicus brief, which is not participating in the litigation per se. It's simply providing a viewpoint of which the court does not have to even accept the amicus brief.
Correct.
So there's a number of things here, but I do think it's a unique circumstance that this committee finds itself in, and whether or not a precedent should be made for committees independently joining in on amicus briefs drafted by lawyers in the last minute, and how the Wyoming legislature might find itself as a whole participating in litigation across this country in the form of amicus briefs by lawyers willing to draft free legal briefs. And I urge great caution on that front, and do think that we should maybe deliberate it a little more thoughtfully and perhaps decide in the morning about moving forward in that regard. I can distinguish this particular action here between others that may occur, but I don't think others would appreciate that distinguishment. So I just urge great caution, and maybe some of the legal complexities that we may find ourselves in by having retained counsel acting on behalf of a select committee, when I believe that we would be typically represented by our attorney general in those types of things in some other type of capacity, and work through that front. Again, no tax dollars.
The executive branch.
Now, I understand that at times the attorney general represents the executive branch, but make no mistake, when we pass laws, they certainly defend us on those fronts. And so there is a complexity there that needs to be considered. Let's take a minute and think about it overnight. But certainly the efforts made in this regard to provide Wyoming's story and the importance of this effort, I think are worthwhile, and would like to see this move forward, but I would not vote for it now based on those concerns.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
And I think tomorrow morning is a perfectly reasonable time to revisit this, and we can have some more chance and an opportunity to chat about it tonight. I do think one of the unique aspects of this particular topic, and the reason why, as Senator Nethercutt was discussing, is it appropriate for legislators or select committees to weigh in at various times, or individual legislators. This was effectively a project of co-chairman Olson and I, but we wanted to bring it to the entirety of the committee, and certainly all of us as individuals can choose to sign on to amicus briefs or participate in amicus briefs as individual legislators. And as you pointed out, Senator Nethercott, it could be taken with a grain of salt, it could be taken seriously, or whatever the case may be. A unique circumstance here, though, is the storyline for this particular piece of legislation with regard to the Speedy Bank that came through the task force, actually, but it's many of the same members, and it was the precursor to the select committee, was based on an expectation through extended consultations between members of this committee and the Legislative Service Office at the time, and folks from the Federal Reserve, that honestly, this legislation would be treated fairly and appropriately. And in fact, there was draft sharing that went on, and there were some assurances that language that was in the draft would not be necessary, that related to potential lawsuits or filing remedies in that fashion. And it seems that that information is legislative branch information. It's not really something that we would expect the AG's office and the executive branch to bring forward, that particular storyline. So it's unique to the story. It's the circumstances that lead to how we got to be where we are, that in my view and co-chairman Olson's view, seems to make it a useful tool for the court in this circumstance. But again, that is subject to interpretation, and we can chat more and discuss it this evening and revisit for tomorrow.
Mr. Reveal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just maybe one question to consider as you discussed tonight too is, does it help or hurt to bring in the committee, which includes the founder and CEO of the plaintiff in this case? Thank you.
The perception of impropriety.
Yeah, but it's a good point. No. Yeah. Well, we'll revisit this issue tomorrow morning. I appreciate that.
Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not being a lawyer, we'll move forward on this and see how well the lawyers attack. My concern would be, would this in some way set a precedence for other committees, whether they be regular committees or other committees, to feel like they could do the same circumstance for certain issues, stepping out of bounds of maybe the realm of what we really are outlined to do as a legislature. I'm just wondering, does it open the door for something we didn't see as an intended circumstance?
And Representative Stitt. And Mr. Chairman, I don't want to keep us all here longer than we need to be, but I guess the issue on amicus briefs is that is the amicus bringing something forward that the party who's the party to the lawsuit might not be able to. So, amicus briefs are really useful, for example, when you've got someone representing an entire industry or some concern that may not be properly advocated for by the party, because the party may not have sufficient incentive to advocate on behalf of that interest that's actually at stake in the litigation. And so I guess I'd appreciate sort of your thoughts on why this amicus brief is needed, why the party Custodia itself can't make all the same arguments.
Yeah, Representative Stitt, I think as we contemplate this evening and into the morning, I think it maybe you'd have to take off your lawyer hat for a moment because it's not about I'm not sure it's necessarily about providing an additional legal argument that can't be made by the plaintiffs themselves, but it's rather the action of showing to the industries that are involved and to the people of Wyoming that we care enough about where we are now and why we're not across the finish line, that we want to do whatever it takes to get us across the finish line. I think that's more of why also it's being presented to the committee, because to be clear, the brief would not be on behalf of the select committee, because it couldn't be. And maybe that's part of the discussion we've had. It's the members, it's the individual members of this committee who we're asking you to sign on to. But the legislative branch did not retain counsel. So I think there's a distinction there, that so to answer Senator Costa's concern about a committee going outside of maybe what it might be used to. First, I would say this is a statutory committee, so its authority is in statute. It's not necessarily granted by management council or as a standing committee would be, or governed by the rules of what a standing committee might be governed by. It's governed statutorily by what is set in statute. That being said, that's not really what's happening. The select committee would not be sponsoring the brief. In essence, would be the individual members as individuals. I hope maybe that provides a distinction, but think about it. But I think that's some food for thought on the why.
And Mr. Chairman, I'll make one more note.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman.
And it's important to realize that we can't bind the legislature. We're not speaking on behalf of the legislature, and that should be clear to everyone. The legislature is not a bindable entity, so to speak, in something like this, and it is not the legislative branch. It is in our individual capacities, and then that can be extended to the collective members of the select committee.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
I'm happy to discuss this offline. I think that conversation should go there. But since we're not doing that, the motion says unopposed motion of the Wyoming Select Committee. I understand it's a draft that will be filed tomorrow. So we probably need to get that figured out very carefully. Those are really big details.
Semantics.
Mm.
But all right. Anything else? Sure, Senator Costa.
Thank you. But would a lawyer be able to say, even though they're the individuals of the committee, they comprise the committee, therefore they can represent both? I'm just saying, would it be interpreted as, because every one of them are all on the members of the committee, that's also representative of the committee as well as the individuals? Or would you have to explicitly say, as individuals, and that might be what you're talking about in the way that title goes?
I feel like you'll receive adequate counsel from your Senate attorney this evening. All right, committee, with that, we will we'll adjourn for the evening, and we'll see you all.